All right, that looks like it's ready. So we'll kick things off. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to Data Platform Down Under for the month of April. Alongside myself, I've got Martin Catherall hosting us this month once again. And this month we've got Heidi Hastings joining us from Adelaide. So while Martin and I are in the future, Heidi's behind us, and we've got a few on the call who are behind us as well. So given the world we live in international time zones, it's always good to have fun with people on what's happening in the future, what's happening in the past, etc. So what have we got Heidi talking to us about? Security fundamentals in Microsoft Fabric, giving us a high-level overview. Okay, so this session is going to be recorded, so you are able to come back and rewatch this or any of the other sessions that we have hosted and recorded for Data Platform Down Under. If you haven't already joined up the meetup, we will put those how you can join the meetup in the chat. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. Both Martin and I will be looking at that, and we'll be able to put those through to Heidi at the appropriate time. So with that, I'll hand over to Heidi and we'll get today's session running.
Awesome. Thanks, Warwick and Martin and team. All right. Now we've only got 45 minutes. It will be a bunch of slideware because to do all the demos, it takes a bit of time. So I'm going to be talking you through all the security fundamentals in Microsoft Fabric. And probably the very first myth buster I will tell you is that Microsoft Fabric has always had security. There was a bit of a misconception that it didn't have security with roadmap items like One Security, Universal Security. It's always had security. It's just getting changed and evolves over time. But I'm going to give you a high-level overview so that you have the fundamentals to get started with Microsoft Fabric and consider security in any solution design work that you might be doing. So what we're going to cover, we're going to talk about a bit of an intro on Microsoft Fabric, understanding the security model being layered. We're going to go into some of the item security controls specifically, and I'll talk to you through some of the best practices for integrating security and some of the practical lessons learned that I've done over the time. Probably should say a bit about me. My name is Heidi Hastings, as Warwick introduced me. I am based in Adelaide, South Australia when I'm home, but you'll often find me around the world at different technical conferences, whether it be like boot camps, DevOps days, FabCons, Past Summit, Data Saturday, SQL Saturday, you name it. I love traveling around for it. Later in the year, I'll be at Power Platform Conference for something different. I am an MVP and an MCT as well. So first thing to be aware of with Microsoft Fabric security is that there are layers to it. So you've got everything from a tenant security setting to network security, capacity security, workspace security, app, item, in-item, and also connections have their own security. So when we look at that in terms of layers, you start with your tenant. So your tenant is basically, if you went to app.powerbi.com or app.fabric.microsoft.com, you're accessing a tenant, and that tenant is tied to an Entra directory. So for example, my tenant is HeidiHastings.com. And so any user that has a HeidiHastings.com domain Entra listing will go to that same tenant. You can, of course, guest into other tenants, and your security permissions in those tenants will be slightly different. But at the tenant level, that's our highest level. We've also got network security. So whilst Fabric is a software as a service platform or a SaaS platform, there are still network security controls that come into play, whether it be from your Entra conditional access policies or it's from things like private endpoints and private links. There is a layer of network security that is available. Then we've got our capacity. And if you've never looked at Fabric before, all Fabric workspaces must be attached to a Fabric capacity. A capacity is an Azure resource item. I know it's very confusing, with the exception of a trial. A trial within the Fabric tenant is spun up solely within the Fabric tenant and is at F64 capacity minus the Copilot features, but it exists only within Fabric. Whereas every other capacity resource that you spin up, you'll spin up on the Azure side. They'll be attached to an Azure subscription and therefore an Azure directory and an enterprise account. And then those will then appear in the matching Fabric tenant. So like I said, for me, HeidiHastings.com, if I've got Azure subscriptions for that, anytime I put a Fabric capacity in those Azure subscriptions, they'll automatically appear on my Fabric tenant, and then I can attach them to workspaces. So we've got capacity settings. But when it comes to security, you've got two flavors. One is going to be on the Azure side with the RBAC controls, and the other is going to be on the Fabric side, which is more feature controls. Then we've got our workspace. Our workspace is basically a container. If you've worked with Power BI before, it is the same concept there where you containerize all your objects and items inside a workspace. You can go across workspaces with a solution, which also makes security across workspace consideration as well. Then you've got app. App really only applies to Power BI items, but because they're related to Fabric items, it's important to be aware that there's also app security. Then we've got item security, which is within the workspace. Every single thing that we create is considered to be an item, sometimes referred to as an artifact. And then that item has its own security. So that's your item level, often referred to as item level sharing or item permissions. And then you've got in-item security. So some, but not all, of the Fabric items contain in-item security. So the common ones are those that can contain a storage element. So Lakehouse, Warehouse. I've put here KQL database because even though a KQL database sits within the event house itself doesn't have a security mechanism. It's all shared at the KQL database level. And then folder and files are applicable when it comes to Lakehouse specifically. But that's where we talk about One Lake security, or I like to call it Lakehouse security, but it now has broadened. One Lake security, the intent is for it to be more broader, but realistically, it's slowly rolling out. So it started with the Lakehouse. They more recently introduced it at some of the other items, and it'll get further and further over time. At the tenant level, that tenant level, I call it like the feature gatekeeper. The person that is the tenant admin, so this used to be the Power BI admin Entra role. It is now called the Fabric admin Entra role. Anyone in that role, as well as global admin or Power Platform admin, gets the ability to control the tenant settings. Last check, I think there was over 130 tenant settings. I'd have to double check the current count because I saw 2 more appear this week. So that tenant level setting is often where you're controlling things like, can users use AI, OpenAI? Can they use GitHub as a repository source? And then can they integrate that with Fabric? Can they use any preview items? So at the moment, things like operational agents are preview, Graph API, stuff like that. So that's why I call it a bit of the feature gatekeeper. That tenant level setting area is only visible to that Fabric tenant admin. It is not visible to any other role within the Fabric ecosystem. So a single setting, you can block features. So if you think export to Excel is not something you want to use, you can turn it off at the tenant level. That blocks it from being able to access at any other point. If you are looking to leverage it, I would consider using the Entra Privileged Identity Management and have that access as time-bounded, but also auditable. So you can make it so that within Entra, you go, right, this security group is going to be able to PIM into the Fabric admin role. When they do, they have to supply the reason for them doing it, and it's time boxed for a period of time. And then once they've done that, they appear in the Fabric tenant admin. They can go to any tenant administration work, and then they come back out of that role. You probably also want to consider having 2 accounts, one that they use for tenant admin, one that they use more broadly for any development work, just to keep that separation of security in case that account gets compromised. You don't want it to compromise all your data engineering, data science, report work, as well as the tenant. So you want to be considerate on whether you have a single Entra user for that or multiple Entra roles where you go like a normal account and an admin account. If we have a look at what that looks like on the platform. So if you were in the Fabric administrator role and you go into the little gear icon and you go into 3/4 of the way down, you'll see admin settings. When you look at that, this is what you're looking at. So you see all the different features. They're broken down into sections. I think at last count, there was about 13 sections. But the best thing that you can do for yourself is use the search feature. Now, not the search feature that appears right up the top here. There's a little search feature that appears just to the right of this gray box, and that allows you to search for a specific tenant setting. But also, you'll notice that gray bit there that says, this is the new stuff. So since the last time you accessed it, if you expand, that'll show you the new tenant settings that Microsoft's been adding. These are available to access through an API as well. So you can call the tenant API to be able to pull out all those settings, as well as whether they're enabled or disabled. If you've gone to the level of putting in a security group, whether it be security group by inclusion or by exclusion. So you can say things like this is enabled for the whole tenant except for this particular group. That information is all available in the API. So you can pull that out. And what I recommend customers do is pull that out, put it into a lakehouse or any other storage mechanism within the Fabric platform, and then put a Power BI report on it and publish it out as an enterprise-wide app. And that way you're surfacing that information to all your users. A, they don't have to hassle you for is this enabled or disabled, because they can go self-serve that information. But B, they can also see the security group. So if they're not a member of that group, that may trigger them to identify which group they need to request access to. And that way you can have it as an information serve back out to your users. The other thing to be aware of at a tenant level is we've got the concept of domains. Now, this is domains. The term is referenced in multiple Microsoft products. This is not consistent with any of those. So this is domains solely within Fabric. So this does not have an integration with Purview, doesn't have an integration with Entra. When you create a domain, you can have a domain and subdomains, and you can also tie security to it. So you'll notice here that we can have a default security group applied. That means anytime someone is in that group and they go do something like create a workspace, it'll automatically attach this domain to them. So you could have domains being business units within your organization, or it could be security boundaries. You might say, all right, this is the domain for HR, people and culture. This is the domain for finance. This is the domain for IT. Put your relevant IT groups in there and HR and finance. And then anytime they're creating workspaces, boom, that domain automatically appears. It's an easy way to tag and identify your workspaces, but does have a security element to it. The capacity, whilst the capacity does have a number of settings, we also at a tenant level can delegate some of those 139 plus settings down to a capacity. So while we can do that, it means that if we pick any of those tenant settings and say, right, I'm going to delegate that down to the capacity level, and in some cases Microsoft defaults it, so you'll notice here that it's grayed out, that check, but it is checked. That's where Microsoft's automatically set it. Then at the capacity level, the capacity admin can go change the value for that. So you want to be mindful that if you're doing any audits or any security setup, if you've delegated a control, what does the capacity admin set it to, or what is the guidance for the capacity admin going forward? Because you don't want them to be overriding tenant settings if they're not supposed to. And if they do, you want to know so that you're aware of your security posture within your organization. So one of the examples is users can create Fabric items. Sometimes you want to delegate that to only be available to a particular capacity, and that might be your pilot group of users that are testing out Fabric. If you don't have that, you've still got a Fabric tenant, but you just can't create any Fabric items. So it is possible to have a Fabric tenant and only work with the Power BI feature set. Perfectly reasonable. Happens to a lot of users as well when they are transitioning from the P SKU of capacities, which is previously the Power BI premium capacities, which all organizations were advised, I think January 2025, that effective their next renewal, they'd need to switch to the F SKU capacity. But some of them don't necessarily want to go to Fabric yet, so you can turn off that tenant setting of users can create Fabric items. You've still got a Fabric capacity, but that tenant setting's off, so you won't have Fabric items appear on your tenant. Network security is an interesting one because you've got private endpoints and private links. Private endpoints operate very similar to Azure PaaS World, but the thing to be aware of with private link is when you read the description of private link, the very first thing it'll say is private endpoint, which makes it very confusing. But I treat it as the front door control. It's the access to the tenant itself. You can do it at a tenant level and a workspace level. For a while there, people have been discussing, should I do it at tenant? Should I do it at workspace? It really depends because this front door control can also limit some of the feature set within Fabric. So not all features support private link. One that becomes very confusing straight off the bat is on-prem data gateways. If you look at the limitations of on-prem data gateways, there'll be a bullet point in there that basically says they don't work with private link. And then you read a bit further down and it'll basically say, turn off private link, set up your gateway connection, then turn private link back on, which effectively would mean it works, but it doesn't work to configure it while private link's on. So then you've got to be mindful of what features are available or not available, or do you need to turn private link off to be able to configure them and then turn it back on? And is that something you want to do? The other thing with private endpoints specifically is they're only usable with certain items. Notebook is the main one. So when people were using private endpoints and then they wanted to use pipelines, they quickly realized you couldn't. So it's important when you are looking at the network security controls, and these are changing all the time, is which items support those network security controls, so that if you do choose to have a network security control, then you have to be mindful of your choice when you're engineering something. What are your actual engineering options for ingesting that data in, or for pushing data to Fabric, as the case may be. Then we've got inbound and outbound controls. So private link, private endpoint is very good at controlling that inbound, but now we've also got the ability to control at the outbound level, which is a workspace configuration. So for those of you who evaluated notebooks probably 6+ months ago, you would have found that there was no outbound access control for a notebook. So you could create a Spark notebook and have your data be written out to anywhere in the world. And there wasn't the ability to block that from a technical level. It would only be from an internal organizational policy level. But now Microsoft's introduced outbound access controls on the workspace so that you can configure that to restrict where your data is going from within the platform to other locations. So something to be mindful there. And of course, the alternative to private link, because quite frankly, I've never seen anyone implement private link yet. At a tenant level, I've heard about it at conferences and events, and there was a lot of debate around tenant v workspace. But what I've also found is that Microsoft Intune conditional access policies often cover the outcomes that the organizations are looking for. So they want to make sure that anyone accessing their Fabric tenant is authorized in their Entra, which is covered by the single sign-on aspect. If you use things like MFA, conditional access, making sure that they're doing a second factor authentication on those accounts, but then also, are they using a corporate issued device, and are they coming from a corporate network to access that? So your conditional access policies within Entra can often cover the requirements of an organization. So if you think the limitations of private link are a bit much, then consider whether conditional access policies on the Entra side is sufficient for your org, or a combination of all these things. That's the other thing with that layering. You can combine a lot of this security. When we look at the capacity, so the capacity, I see that as like who pays for it, who controls it, who gets the access to it. So it's more of that resource governance, because the capacity ultimately is the compute for any workspace that's attached to it. So you can have more than one workspace on the same capacity. But the person who has the RBAC control on the capacity is the person who can pause it, resume it, and scale it. So whilst you might spin up a capacity as an F2, the person who has Azure RBAC contributor and above permissions on that resource can actually change it from an F2 up to an F2048 or anywhere in between. They could also pause it and they can resume it. Now, if you're using reserve pricing, pause and resume is less of a thing to consider, other than if someone pauses a capacity, every single Fabric feature becomes unavailable for that. So if someone's paused a capacity and you go to a workspace that is using that capacity, you'll get a nice little pop-up that'll let you know. It won't use the words the capacity is off, but it'll basically say you've got an unavailable workspace. You can still see the Power BI items, you just can't see the Fabric ones. If you're using the Fabric CLI, it will also not return the Fabric items, but it will return the Power BI and won't give you an error. But most likely it's because someone's turned your capacity off. The reason you would do that, save money if you're doing page costing, non-production environments. So that's the key kicker there. It is an infrastructure level control. So it's where that business continuity meets security. So where you go in and go, right, I'm turning it off, then no one can access that content in those workspaces. But it is also where it only occurs on the Azure side. So if your data engineers, platform engineers don't have access to the Azure RBAC control, they can't touch it. What they can do on the Fabric side, though, is they can do those delegation settings. They can attach workspaces to a capacity. They can remove workspaces from a capacity, or move them around, as the case may be. And so you've got that alternate approach where you can give them no access on Azure and just give them access as a capacity admin, and then they can add and remove workspaces and work with the Fabric settings, but not actually touch the SKU scaling or the pause and resume. So as I said there, on the Azure RBAC side, and then skip through, and then also on the Fabric side. Now, what does that look like? If you're in Azure, this is where you're going. You're looking at a particular Fabric resource. So you can see here that I can go in and see who's got controls on that Fabric resource and what they can do with them. And then they can go in and hit the pause and resume. Now, there's no auto scaling concept, but you can set up solutions that call the APIs for Azure to pause and resume and scale. Be mindful if you're moving workspaces from one capacity to another, that is possible, But as soon as you use any level of storage, so Lakehouse, Warehouse, Event House, KQL database, and Fabric SQL database, but less Fabric SQL database because of how it works. With the others, as soon as you start using storage, you can't automatically move the workspace from one capacity to another. You can you actually have to do a migration to move the data over, because of course the capacity has a region, and the region tells the OneLake where to store it in terms of the region storage. When we go into the admin portal as a capacity admin, we can see the capacity settings. The trial people can also see this setting as well, but they will only see the trial tab within it. I've already clicked into the Fabric Capacities tab and into a specific capacity. And then you can see here we've got the delegated tenant settings. So this is where it will surface just the settings that the tenant admin has delegated down to a capacity. And then it'll be an area where you can add or remove capacity admins as well. So once you are an admin, you can add another admin in here. Recommend to always have 2 or more admins. Standard use case, someone goes on leave, you need to have a second person, even if they're just there as a backup, but not there as their day-to-day role or responsibility. So they shouldn't use it unless they are delegated into it. And you can put groups in here as well. When we come to a workspace level, this is where the teams meet the data. So this is where you can control the team boundaries. And often you'll set up workspaces either from the perspective of what is the data solution that it's going to contain, or what is the team that's going to maintain it. I think a workspace is the sweet spot of security. You've only got the 4 roles, which is a little bit limiting, but to go any lower is like higher complexity on your OPEX cost, on your operational maintainability. Not saying any of those aren't good to do. Item level permissions are great, in items great, but if you can do it at a workspace, I think it's that nice sweet spot of maintaining it. You can put users and groups into those roles. You can API provision them as well. And then within the workspace, you decide whether, often I'll split it going, right, this is the front end, this is where I put my Power BI reporting. I might even have a separate workspace for semantic models if I want to allow self-service build permissions. Then all my back-end engineering might be in a separate workspace that only my data engineers can get to, and a separate one for storage if I need to restrict who's got access to the various Lakehouse, Warehouse, Fabric SQL database, KQL databases. I may consider separating them out. So often a data product solution will go across workspaces, but there's also nothing wrong with having them all within the one workspace. It's just being mindful of, if you've put everything in the one workspace, you're most likely going to do item level permission management, and then that's an overhead you've just got to work with, which is also perfectly fine. Some clients I work with, they'll do a workspace level permission for their data engineering teams and their platform admins. And then at an item level, they'll do sharing for like report developers, content developers. And they'll keep the engineering is the one that's moving all the data in and out and around. And then they'll leave it so that they have centralized modeling solutions. And then those are consumable by report builders and developers, but they'll have access to build on top of the semantic model, but not necessarily access the underlying Lakehouse, Warehouse, Event House, etc. The key thing to be aware of is how the roles at the workspace translate, because a workspace role also gives you inherent permission at the item level and in item level, and sometimes they don't all coexist nicely. So you can have the ability to have a workspace role and then have like a deny permission on like a Fabric Warehouse. Or you might have a no workspace level or just a viewer, and then you go to use like Spark notebooks against like a warehouse or a lakehouse, and you find you don't have the right level of permission because you've only got viewer. And so then you've got to do the item permissions to adjust that security. But consider the workspace as where you want to tie it. Also, a workspace is linked to the capacity, and the capacity is where you scale your compute up and down. So that's where you want certain solutions you might want in a particular workspace, mainly so you can scale them up or have a higher compute. And then on the other ones, you might want a lower compute. So for example, my Power BI reporting, I want is always available. I give that its own workspace with its own capacity. And then I have my engineering on a different capacity because my engineering workload is often going to spike and come down. So I want to be able to scale that up and down appropriately to work with. So you kind of combine your security plus your storage plus your CU consumption as you're designing out your solutions. We've got those 4 workspace roles. Now this is a mapped out from the Microsoft one, but I actually put a question mark on this viewer read data, because the problem with read data generically here, people will take that as the viewer has access to read data. But the thing to be aware of is they have read access from the perspective of the explorers but not from necessarily the endpoints. So, for example, if you only had viewer at a workspace, what I noticed when I was testing this out is I had a user with viewer on a workspace. They go to the lakehouse in the Explorer, perfectly fine. They can see the tables, lovely. When they switch the SQL endpoint and try to write a SQL query, they don't have access. And when they switch to a notebook to write a query there, they also don't have access because there's different read permissions. So there's read all and read all data, and they tie to the Spark access and to the SQL access. So this read is more from an Explorer level. So depending on what your users are using in terms of their tooling, whether they're using the browser and accessing the SaaS platform, or they're running something like Studio, Excel, Power BI, desktop, all the things, you want to be mindful of while that viewer says read data, yes, it's usually with just the Explorer. So if they need to use the SQL endpoint or the Spark access, you need to make sure they have the item level permission appropriate for that. At an item level, we've got that individual item control. This is where you want to share without oversharing. And strategically, it's where you want to reduce your exposure to your data. Because at an item level, you can restrict who can get to a particular item. So you might want to say, I'm okay with the data analyst being able to access, say, the lakehouse, but I don't want them executing notebooks in the workspace, and I don't want them running pipelines or Dataflow Gen 2s or whatever. So that's where you can control that. And I should point out, at this point in time, there is no concrete way to restrict access to a particular item. So as soon as someone has contributor or above, so contributor member admin at a workspace, and they've got the tenant setting users can create fabric items, they can create any one of the, I think last count, 57 item types. So you want to be either running API calls to see what they're doing, running event stream checks on the fabric event stream to see if they're creating an item you don't want them to create, or just generally providing guidance to your users to say, hey, look, this is the preferred list of items we support within the organization, but Fabric being SaaS, it's kind of like an all or nothing. So when you say users can create fabric items, they can create all of them, which can be quite overwhelming for orgs when they start to see people creating all these different item types that they weren't expecting, things like mirroring, things like operational agents, although that one has a tenant setting because it's in preview, so that one you can turn off. But for a while there, users weren't realizing that people were creating anything and everything because they can. So you got to be mindful. It's all enabled. There isn't a tenant setting to say, I only want lake houses in this workspace, or I only want pipelines, not notebooks. You can't deal with that on a security level. So you have to do it in different controls. I have heard of orgs where they actually run scripts to purge. If anyone creates a particular item type on their tenant, they just delete it. No warning, just delete it, because they've already warned them by nature of their internal organization policies. So they run automation scripts to purge any items to prevent it from happening. At an item security level, you often go to the item, you hit the ... little hover over ellipse button, and you'll get either manage permissions, share, or another named menu item. Yep, they're not consistent. And then you'll be given the permissions associated with that item. So a lakehouse here, we can go in and you see we've got the ability to give someone, if I just entered my user here and said grant access, they would get access to the Explorer and nothing else. So if they tried to go to the SQL Analytic endpoint, they wouldn't be able to run a query. If they tried to connect with Spark, they wouldn't be able to. And if they tried to connect Power BI desktop in, the default semantic model no longer exists, but not all of the menu items have been updated to remove it because it still exists on some of the tenants. So, but that's going to disappear, generally speaking. So this is what you look at for a lakehouse. If you go to a warehouse, you've got more options because you've got the ability to also provide the user access just to do auditing, monitoring, and share the reshare permission. I avoid the reshare permission unless I have a security model in the organization that says, look, I'm going to share it with this group of users and they're given delegated security authority to reshare with other people. Generally speaking, that doesn't happen because it's usually a specific group of users who control the security more broadly. And if you're using something like Microsoft Purview, yes, Purview has the option to say, hey, can I request access to something? It doesn't go and grant the access though. It just notifies people. But that's something else to be aware of is if you want to use Purview to manage your security, how does that translate to actually the Fabric security model? And vice versa. If you do security management through third-party things, whether you're doing like ServiceNow, Heat, Marvel, any ticketing system, then you want to make sure that you include in that request for access the different item permissions that you want available to people. Something you can also do is, let's say you want to automate it. You can use something like Microsoft Forms to automate it and say, hey, look, request access, provide the workspace, the item, and the permission you want. And then you can use the APIs to process that request using something like Power Automate to call the APIs to grant the user access. But often you want to control it at Entra security groups. So usually people will then go into the security group, which means it's an Entra security permission management as opposed to adjusting all the permissions in Fabric to add individuals. And I think the last check, when I tested adding individuals, I think you can go up to about 15,000 individuals added to something, and then it'll kind of like not be happy. So you want to look to do security groups where you can, but then that means having either delegated administration of those security groups in Entra or having a really good Entra team who can respond to your security requests on demand. So this is your warehouse one. The other thing to be aware of is you noticed in that GUI, it's a very nice textual description like read all data using SQL. But when you're actually looking at the permissions management of an item, it doesn't say read all data using SQL. It just says read data, write, reshare. So you have to map the permissions code effectively or word to the permission label, and they're all different. So this gets very confusing when you're trying to order permission management, where you go, all right, users got read. What does that actually translate to? Oh, the Explorer. Users got read data. What does that translate to? Ah, that's the SQL endpoint. Cool. They've got read all. Right, they can get into the OneLake, so they could run the OneLake Explorer, access the Delta Parquet, and they could do work with the data there, or they can actually go into the workspace. That sort of thing. Power BI hasn't really changed. Manage permissions, you go in, but you'll notice the GUI looks a little bit different here because you've just got the little checkbox buttons and you go in and add your user. But the same thing occurs where it adds a permission code. So when you say, the recipient can share this report, they have the reshare permission. Recipient can build content, they have the build permission on the underlying semantic model, that sort of stuff. At the semantic model, that also hasn't changed with the introduction of Fabric. Same thing applies there. We've got the different options. The KQL database is an interesting one. This screenshot has actually been fixed. This was as at September last year. There was actually a bug with the GUI where it had a blank checkbox. They quickly fixed that. But you'll notice now that a lot of the Fabric things are starting to show share dialogues that look very much like OneDrive. I'm very curious as to why there's a PowerPoint button that's disabled. I'm going to assume it's the same code they use for OneDrive because I can't imagine anyone sharing to PowerPoint here. I can see that from Power BI, but that's got the embed in PowerPoint, whether it's live or static. But in this case, you go in, you actually put the users in, and then you have to click in to get the list of individualized permissions for that particular thing. So the KQL one is different to the warehouse and the lakehouse. So this is where it can also get very confusing when you're working with the people managing permissions, because if you're using all three of those items, they all have three different dialogues and they all act a little bit differently. So it's kind of annoying and frustrating for an org to manage security in a consistent way. Environments also have the ability to do the sharing of an environment, so you can leverage that environment across different groups of people. When it comes to item security, so this is the in-item level controls. We've, of course, got row level security. Now, row level, fortunately, does apply to all four of the storage aspects. So your Lakehouse, your warehouse, KQL database. I have not included Fabric SQL database in any of my slide deck, by the way. So that's why you'll notice I don't talk about it. It is more akin to Azure SQL security model. So if you're familiar with Azure SQL, you'll be cool with Fabric SQL. Fabric SQL database and warehouse are also very similar, but their underlying storage is not the same. So warehouse, of course, has Delta Parquet. Fabric SQL database does not. So you've got Lakehouse, Warehouse, Semantic Model, KQL. Those are the ones you can do row level security on. Row level security here does prevent users from accessing specific rows of data. Now, the workspace permission, if they have an elevated permission there, it discounts the row level security. So the workspace permission would override it. Column level permissions only applies at Lakehouse, Warehouse, and Semantic Model, doesn't apply at the KQL database. KQL does support a level of obfuscation or control to the columns, but I wouldn't call it column level security because ultimately they can access it all. The other thing to be aware of is dynamic data masking is not a security control. It's a data obfuscation control, and there are elements to which you can get around it if you have an elevated permission somewhere else in the inherited stack. So I wouldn't use it as a security control. But also be mindful if you do something like dynamic data masking at the warehouse, and then you put a semantic model on it, and then you consider doing fixed security on the semantic model, like an import mode, then of course that defeats the purpose, because then your data is either fully masked or fully unmasked. Because the semantic model, similar to Azure Analysis Services and SQL Server Analysis Services in the box product on-prem, when we had dynamic data masking in SQL Server, which we still do have, then the semantic model could only ever like mask or unmask. The semantic model doesn't have the permissions to unmask on the fly. So it can't exactly pass through and unmask. The difference being if you were doing direct query models, because that is running a query as the user under the hood, then that's a little bit different. But generally speaking, treat it as a data obfuscation, not as a data security, and be mindful if you're going to use it, how it's going to work in the different layers of access that you have. OLS, or object level security, in this case, it is not the same or to be confused with one lake security, which is also OLS. Object level security only applies to the semantic model and can apply to the T-SQL surface area, but you can't do a permission set to test it. So whereas the semantic model within Power BI Desktop, you can go in and say, I want to view this as this user and see what it looks like. You can't do that in T-SQL because you're trying to impersonate an Entra account. So you can't just go in and test it out. So if you do set up object level security to test that, you will need to use the actual user that you've applied the security to, or have some test accounts that you leverage and switch logins as to see how they look. Now, OneLake security or Lakehouse security, but this is also expanded. I've only included the Lakehouse level, but it has expanded in recent months to include other items. But it's where you can restrict access to a particular set of tables or a particular set of files. Now, where this can be really handy, and the screen on the right is actually for a demo that I've actually hidden in the interest of time. But what you can do is consider where you're like, why would I have file level security? Well, the key use case there is where you've got business users that provide a data set, whether it be a CSV, an Excel file, a flat file, or something file. They would be able to go into a lakehouse and drop the file in. So you could consider in previous worlds, if you were doing SQL Server on-prem, you might have had a network share or a SharePoint folder where your business users drop the file in. If you decide to have them go straight to the lakehouse and put the file in, you may want to restrict where in the lakehouse they can drag and drop files or upload, because it's a great way to be able to use that lakehouse to have those business users provide you data. Sure, we've got, like anything with Microsoft, there's more than one way to do it. You can now do shortcuts to like SharePoint things. So that's another way. Or you could do shortcut to like an Azure storage account. They could load it over there. Really depends on what you want to do for your org, because it's nice to be able to, mount the Azure storage account to their desktop, and then they go in and connect to it, drag and drop the file, open up SharePoint. They're usually quite familiar with that, drag and drop the file. But it's one and the same to be able to teach them, hey, this is a lakehouse, here's where you upload the file, or here's the OneLake Explorer on your desktop, acts like OneDrive, double click, click to the workspace, click to the lakehouse, drop the file in. So you can restrict access there. You also might want to restrict access to a full table or tables. So you might want to do in the lakehouse, go, right, these 5 tables are finance, we'll give finance team access to that. These other tables are, my transportation team, they get access to that. So if you did want to have a lakehouse that you're sharing across teams but restricting their access, OneLake security is great for that. It is a little bit confusing is probably the best word, confusing and complex, the OneLake security, and it's ever evolving. So you always have to reevaluate it and test it to see how it's going to function for your scenarios. And because it's applying it at that storage level, you want to be going, all right, if my users need to access the underlying Parquet files in the storage, like they're going into OneLake Explorer and accessing that, can they access it? They need to be able to use the Explorer and go to a lakehouse and access it. They need to be able to run a SQL command, or they need to be able to use Spark, or they need to use Dataflow Gen 2 or Pipeline, connect to it. Then you need to make sure for all those different scenarios, can they do it? And with OneLake security, you've got the concept of whether you're doing pass-through or whether you're doing fixed credential type stuff. So it's deciphering all those options and then rolling that up at the item level and going, right, this is what I have, and then matching that workspace and above. So, of course, if someone's an admin on a workspace, then your OneLake security is kind of like, well, a mute point because they're an admin. But if you give them like viewer and then do OneLake security at the item level, it's going to change what they're getting to within the item itself. It is pretty cool. It's ever evolving. I did see, I think it was only like 3 weeks back, if that they dropped a new API specific to one link security. Before that, it was very manual of the setup, which might not seem too bad until you go over like 10 like tables or objects. Then you're like, really, do I have to click through every single one of these to set this up? I'd rather do API integration. So you want to be doing that. And things like CI/CD as well, you want to leverage the APIs to support that. If you're doing different security models for your environments, like, hey, this is the prod workspace setup, this is the prod permissions, this is the non-prod, this is the non-prod permissions. Or if you're doing UAT testing with users, this is also where Entra security groups, if you can leverage those, then you can kind of have a consistent security model and use the memberships in Entra to dictate who's got access to what. Some of the considerations that we talked through is, and you can't see this, but it was in the demo that I've actually hidden, so I probably should explain that. But basically, when you set up certain security controls like column level permissions, when you create things like Power BI reports, if you've got a column that is restricted, but you include the entire table in the Power BI dataset, it'll actually break all the visuals. Because even whether it's import mode, direct query, actually no, not import mode, because import mode will switch to the semantic model, but predominantly if it's direct query or direct lake, those permissions are going to have a problem with the visual side. So when you're doing the data set within the semantic model, if you remove the column that has the permission on it, then the rest of the behavior in the visuals will be fine. But if it's included in the data set, even if it's not used in the visual will simply display an X. And when the user hovers over their X, it will say select permission denied on and the column. So the thing to be mindful there from a security standpoint is the security control itself is now exposed to the end user, which some organizations don't like. They don't like the evidence of a security control being in place being visible. And in the same way that it also explains what the security control is so that you can tell your users, hey, you need to request access. So it's kind of got pros and cons there. Some orgs don't like it because it exposes the security control. Other orgs love it because it tells the user what they're missing. Either way, if you do that permission, you have to be mindful of how you design any downstream solution, whether it's going to have an issue, because 9 times out of 10, the user sees that X on a visual and they think it's broken. They don't realize that it's by design, and the way that Power BI handles it is to simply display an X. And so for them, they think the report is broken, when really it's like, no, that's expected because the data set has the column, you don't have permission to the column, therefore not displayed. It does increase the complexity in any solution designs you're doing when it comes to security, because the lower controls you go and the inheritance, you have to consider all the patterns through the layers as well as the integrations. So if you did workspace level control, then you're only considering up to that point, how's it going to work? How's it going to inherit? If you go right down into in item, then you have to be mindful of, a user reports, hey, this doesn't work. And then you have to look at the in item security, the item security, the workspace, and the combination, and then go across to the other workspaces and the combination, and then see exactly what's caused the issue. And you also got to remember about the override. Capacity admin can override something at a lower level. So be mindful if the capacity admin's doing something as well, then you've got that. What I suggest you do from a use case security modeling perspective to make it simpler and more easy for your organization to adopt is to basically create some use case scenarios that you have, whether you want to go with a persona-based control or an integration pattern or a reporting pattern that you have, and then provide at the different security constructs, which one is the primary, which is the secondary, what's the recommendation. That way, as your teams are building out solutions, they can go, okay, we need to hide PII data, for example. What should we use for that within our org? Okay, in this case, and this is purely an example, it is not any client-specific data or anything, this is just an example. So if I was going to hide PI in my org, I'd use column level security, and then secondary use object level security, as the case may be. And in some areas, you'll go, if we're only putting the consuming user access on like the semantic model, then your security might be data engineers get full access all the way up to the semantic model. And then from the semantic model downstream to the Power BI report, that's a different security model. And that's the granularity we're going for. As soon as you want to open up, say for lakehouse, warehouse, event house level, then you're going to look at it and go, hang on a minute, I've got to apply permissions for my users at the lakehouse, warehouse, event house level, or KQL database, as well as the semantic model, and how the two models going to interact with each other. Because things like direct lake don't like row level column level security, they will fall back to direct query. So now you have performance considerations because of your security model. And this is ever evolving. But I think having a nice little matrix for your team to go, right, this is the integration pattern, this is the security, here's where we would prefer you use it. Doesn't mean you can't do an alternative. This just gives them an immediate, all right, I'm going to do this security model. Like people will ask me, should I put everything in one workspace? I say, you absolutely can. There's nothing saying you can't. However, what's your security model? Because then if you say, oh, well, I want my report builders to only have access to the semantic model, then, okay, probably either going to shift to multiple workspaces or item security. And then you got to make the trade-off and go, okay, based on what's happening, I'm going to do this. Always consider how you're going to audit it. Consider how you're going to evaluate your security, how you're going to monitor it. If you don't want to roll your own solution, check out something. And I don't work for these people or am paid for them. I just like that they have an option in this space is the Power BI Sentinel team. They have a product that actually surfaces all that security information into a nice UI. It is a paid product, so just be mindful of that. But you can use the APIs to pull out a bunch of the information as well. But anytime you're pulling out that API information, you got to look at the cost to maintain it, the cost to extract it, the cost to surface it up, and is it going to be interrogatable for your audit controls? So always be mindful, whatever security model you have, how you're going to audit it. Do you need to store it for historical changes? Are you going to use Fabric to do it, or do you going to shift a lot of the responsibility over to Entra? Things I didn't cover, workspace identity, custom managed keys, which is a possibility, customer lockbox, connections. One thing I will call out with connections, only the person who created it has access to it. So definitely, and the tenant admin cannot get to it either. So definitely make sure anytime someone creates a connection, they automatically go into that connection and share the connection as an owner, user, or something with another person. Preferably have two owners, and then you can have multiple users and then reshare permission if it's necessary. But please, please, please don't have them, because what happens is people create connections. They have no idea they're even creating them. They go, Power BI built something, hit publish, boom, it creates a new connection because it needs one. It's a personal cloud connection. No one else on the tenant knows it exists. Then you have this massive sprawl problem. Gateways has their own permissions as well. And that is everything. And sorry, I didn't have time for questions, but you're welcome to ask questions if Warwick and Martin don't mind people sticking around. But that's high level overview, all the things.
Got plenty of time, Heidi. Plenty of questions.
Yeah, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. This is a high level. You can spend a whole day on security, just saying, or even longer. I think Microsoft did actually at the last FabCon, did a whole day workshop just on security.
So Heidi, Patrick did a segue around the universe OneLake permissions. How has that filtered through yet, and have you played with it at all?
I've not circled back and replayed with OneLake security just because I wasn't happy with the first couple of iterations of it. Like I think they previewed it back at FabCon Las Vegas, April last year.
Yep.
And I think it was FabCon Atlanta a couple of weeks back that they actually added Event House KQL to it. And so I haven't circled back to retest it because I wasn't happy with the first iteration. Also because if I want granular controls, I tend to go warehouse because it's got a really robust security model that I can do column level security, I can do schema security, I can do table security, and it just works. And I don't have to worry about the underlying people are going to crack open OneLake Explorer and start accessing Parquet files. And what does that mean? But it really depends. So I just haven't deep dived because I haven't had the need to deep dive on it. But I know the other thing that came up actually at FabCon Europe, what was that, September last year, was the integration of the Purview data loss protection controls into Fabric. And that, I think, is, if you're not already using Purview and now I should point out, Purview used to be Purview Risk, Office 365 Risk and Compliance Center and Azure Data Catalog. The two of them are slammed together. Now it's Microsoft Purview. Within that, the information protection can apply to Fabric, but also the data loss protection. So the cool thing I saw in the keynote at Europe was, think about the users using Copilot and they're chatting with their data. Next thing you know, they're trying to access something they're not supposed to. It comes up in the Purview data loss protection controls really well. So if you're trying to find a way to govern your data and put some security controls, that is an area to look at. I don't think it's fully there yet. Like, even with information protection on the Fabric side, it was like, hey, if you've got access to the workspace, you can get to the item regardless of whether you got access to the label, because it wouldn't block it, because the platform itself can't block it. The tools can. So if you open in Excel or you open it in Power BI Desktop, they'll now block your access. But aside from that, you can get in the workspace, you can get in the data. But I think OneLink security is still a little buggy. Anyone I talk to in the community is like, does it work yet? So I'm sort of like skeptical on using it, because the docs say one thing, but like anything, you got to try it out and really go, is this what I want? And I feel like I would prefer to go workspace level, which means I don't need to look at OneLink security. But I can see it as, if it is true to label, is very, very powerful. But what always got me was, it only worked for Lakehouse at the time when I was evaluating it. And I go, well, this doesn't work, because like I see in the chat, someone going, how do you restrict access to a notebook? Well, you can't use OneLink security for that. So while it's touted as the be all and end all, it's be all and end all for just these items. And so when you're trying to do solutions that need, like, if you're doing mirroring, you're like, I'm going to mirror the database. Well, OneLink security is not touching it. So then you're like, well, I got to do my OneLink security and my other item security. So then it just gets a bit confusing. So I don't know if you have, or if anyone else on the call has dived into it more broadly. I think it's getting better. But it's just, yeah, not
No.
quite.
And I guess, as you say, you are much more using Warehouse than Lakehouse, and it comes down to what your requirements and everything are. There's different skill sets required for the use of each of those and how you want to use them. So, and I guess that's the beauty of what we do. We've got different options that we can choose from. We just need to understand what those different options give to us. So, Fernando, with you asking about restricting people using your notebooks, where are you storing your notebooks? I guess that's a bigger question.
And I guess the other one is, what restriction do you want? Like, is using considered them opening it and looking at it? Is using considered them downloading a copy? Or is using considering them actually hitting the execute button, or the run all button, I should say, or even running a cell? Because some of that you can restrict, like a viewer is not necessarily going to have execute permissions. But then if you use the item level control, they may be able to view the notebook, but they don't have access to the thing it's connected to, so they can't actually do anything with it. So I tend to restrict it by sheer nature of putting all the engineering data movement solutions into their own workspace, and basically having it as like an orchestration workspace and keeping it only my engineering team has access. That's how I restrict it. But in theory, you can use item level permissions as well.
Okay, so he's come back and said to run them.
Yeah, just put it in different workspaces. That is the easiest one, is like an orchestration workspace, because then you can go, right, if they've got member contributor admin, they can execute it, viewer can't, but viewer can still view it. But then the other thing to be mindful of is, if you Git integrate any of these solutions, if they've got access on the Git side, they can't run it, but they can see it. So sometimes just the nature of them being able to see the solution is a problem. So then, we didn't talk about it today in the session, but even your Git integration design, because you can have multiple workspaces in the same Git repo, but Git doesn't have the concept of restricting access at a lower level than the repository itself. So as soon as you put multiple workspaces into the same repository, you get visibility on all the repository. Sure, if users aren't savvy enough to crack open the Git side of the fence, they're not really going to be none the wiser, but it is something to be aware of. Is you put it all in the one Git repo, they get access to all of it, even if they don't have access to the workspace. So it's like, great, just another layer to tack on. But no. I should do some patterns. I should do some blogs about some patterns. Here's how you set up the security. Mind you, it'd be like spaghetti. If this, then that.
Well, and then the other side of it is, as you've written one before you get to the next one, you probably have to go back to the first one to update it so that the third one makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think it was the workspace identity stuff has like changed. And then there's even the, oh, does this work with service principal or managed identity or workspace identity? And a workspace identity is a service principal, but not like a fully fledged one. And I'm watching the Entra admins just panic going, hang on, someone ticks this button in Fabric and it creates a service principal in Entra. It's like, yep, good luck.
Okay. Any other questions from anybody else on the call? Feel free to either raise your hand and then we can get you to come off of mute and you can ask your question if that's easier than typing. We've got a couple more minutes that we can keep going while we are waiting. Big thank you to you all for coming along to this month's session. Big thank you to Heidi for giving up her time and presenting for us today. And to Martin, my co-host, who has gone quiet. He hasn't come back off of, he's probably gone off to lunch.
I love this question in the chat too. Critical recommendation. So critical is a bit like easy and hard. It's relative to you and your org. The key ones that stand out for me, users can create Fabric items, the RBAC permissions, something else to be mindful of. If anyone's come from a SQL Server Visual Studio world, where you would get a Visual Studio subscription or an Azure subscription tied to your Visual Studio benefits, the thing that tenant admins never understood is a Fabric tenant admin controls a Fabric tenant. Yep, cool. I have an Azure subscription because my MSDN benefits give me that. I've now got 150 credits. I'm going to spin up a bunch of Fabric capacities in my org. Those automatically appear on the tenant. The tenant admin will be none the wiser unless they actually look at the settings. So, and I have done this before, by the way, is create a bunch of capacities in Azure. The tenant admin has no idea I've done it. And then I go start using them in Fabric. Because as soon as I've got the users can create Fabric item permission on that tenant, I can go attach my workspace to the capacity I just created and off I go. Because I'm the capacity admin because I created the resource. So from a critical privilege standpoint, if you've got users with those benefits, they have their own Azure subscription, it's tied to your Entra directory, which is therefore linked to that same Fabric tenant. So watch out for that. Users going rogue and creating their own capacity because they can't wait for you. Also, use that to try stuff out. People were going, how do I try out Copilot? Because Fabric trial doesn't include Copilot. Yeah, spin up the capacity in your benefits, attach it to your tenant, put it as well, it used to be F64, but F2 and above, right? Now you can go try out Copilot and then hit pause, and you're not costing the company money because you've just tried it in the benefits. So that's one of them. Export to Excel, turn it off. Not saying you can't use it, right? It's a great feature, but turn it off and try and do a cultural change of why your users having to export to Excel. Then turn off the OpenAI if you're not ready for it. That one is not on by default. Some of these settings are on by default. So turn off Publish to Web, turn off Export to Excel, turn off OpenAI. Turn on Git because I love source control. But go through those tenant settings with a bit of a fine-tooth comb and just look at the ones that are going to cause you a security risk for your org. Often security is bubbled up. So the one thing on its own might not be a problem, but the combination of that and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing will be. So before Microsoft introduced outbound access controls, I would say to companies, hey, look, if you want to use notebooks, great, but there's no protection if a user decides to code something that writes out to a Dropbox in the public internet, next thing your data's out in the wild. There was no control you could put in place. So, but then you have to be mindful of if you're not doing tenant auditing and admin, start doing it, but also look into real-time intelligence. Why? Because inside the real-time intelligence stack, by default, there's an event stream called Fabric Events. So if you're like a tenant admin, you can create an event stream that captures those Fabric events. So that's everything from created a workspace, changed the permission, created an item, what's the item type, who did it, when did they do it. That's coming through in an event stream, automatically stored in a KQL database. even if you don't know KQL, you can write SQL or you can use Copilot to help you, or GitHub Copilot in like SSMS. Connect to your KQL database, use it to help you write a query. But now you can start seeing the events that are happening on your tenant. And then worst case scenario, you're manual and reactive. Best case scenario, you then tie that to alerting to go, hey, so-and-so just created their own workspace, red flag. Turn off the tenant setting to create workspaces if that's a red flag. Or no, we need that on because we want developers to be able to branch out and create branch solutions. Okay, we'll leave it on, but we'll get alerted every time they create it and go, oi, you created a new workspace. Where's the second admin? We never create a workspace without a second admin. Or, oh, I noticed you've just created an operational agent. That's a preview thing. Can you keep it to this workspace over here, which is where we're piloting that particular item? So you can take that reactive nature and go a bit more proactive and use the event stream and the alerting, because the event stream's built in. You just have to have permissions to what you want to monitor. So if you're a tenant admin, you can go the full tenant. If you're not, you can look at doing the event stream for a particular workspace and start auditing like your proof of concept pilot workspaces, or audit your production ones, because that's kind of critical. So really the recommendation for the admin for BI developer privileges is they're probably going to sit as an admin on workspaces. So they're going to have full privileges there. Use the tenant level to lower their controls a little bit. Probably don't put them as a capacity admin, because developers by their very nature will want to bypass everything and anything that gets in their way of getting the job done, which usually means if they're a capacity admin, they'll go turn things on that you don't want them to, because you want them to go through like a governance group to say, hey, we'd like to turn on this tenant setting. And if they have those controls, they just do it themselves and go, oh, I thought it wouldn't be a problem. Yep, it will be when you have all this sprawl everywhere. And the other thing is, like, it's a tenant, it's tied to your entra. If you run multiple entras for non-prod and prod, like you might have a .com.au or dev.com.au or something, then be mindful that's two separate tenants. So how are you going to manage solutions and settings and all that across the tenants? Because now you've got multiple tenants. But yeah, there's not a set critical thing. I think critical depends on your org, but yeah, I'd go with lockdown users can create fabric items, lock down your capacity admins, lock down your create workspace, turn off the users can sign up for paid features, because when they do that, they're creating fabric trials. Sure, there's a limit of probably 10 or so trials per tenant. But once they do that, it's an F64 capacity and they'll start building all sorts of things. And then what you'll quickly find is they don't know what capacity they need because they've been working with an F64, and then they think they need F64. And for those of you in Australia, that's about 14 grand a month, unless you've got any UB enterprise agreement for like non-gov education where it's a little bit cheaper. I think in the US it's like 8 grand if it's on for the whole month. They can get very expensive very quickly. And then if you start to think about things like Copilot Studios pricing, because it can integrate, our Power Platform integrating and its pricing, Office 365 and its pricing, you end up with this whopping bill that you probably didn't need. So go with, you don't want to lock down too much because you'll get shadow IT, but maybe consider, if you're going to go fabric, do it as a trial proof of concept, do a slice, work out your patterns, your integrations, your blueprints for your teams, and then enable it more widely once you've got a better handle on what you want to do, what you don't want to do, how you're going to audit it, how you're going to monitor it. Look at the capacity metrics app, look at the FUAM solution. Selfish plug, look at the Fabric Essentials listing, which is where myself, Kevin Chant, and John Kursky collate a bunch of community and Microsoft resources that are different utilities that you can use. Check that out, because there's a lot in there that can help you, including like getting a list of things on your Fabric tenant, getting the icons from the Fabric tenant because you want to build out diagrams and stuff, or you just want to like go in and get all the permissions. There's a lot of community solutions already built, so have a look at that to try and get yourself started, and watch out for the blowout and budget. And then maybe look at reserve pricing to help with that, because it has a good reduction in price if you go reserve pricing. If you can commit to a year or more, then it's cheaper. Oh, and I didn't even mention the hybrid stuff like Databricks, Snowflake. You can have Databricks write to Fabric. You can have Snowflake write to Fabric. You can have both of them read from Fabric. So if you want to use another data platform, you can go hybrid. That works too. You can even write an iceberg, which is kind of cool. Yeah.
Hey. Well, if nobody's got any other questions, we'll call it a day for this month. As I said before, big thank you to Martin, big thank you to Heidi, big thank you to you all for coming along and being part of this session and having the opportunity to interact and ask questions and make us think about what we need to know. And you also get to think about, oh, hang on a minute, I didn't even know that existed. So this session has been recorded. Once it's all done and dusted, just need to do some processing of that. It'll get placed up onto Data Platform Downunder. You'll be able to come back and watch that at any point in time, as well as all of the others. So with that, stay tuned for next month's session. We're just in negotiations with our presenter for next month. Martin, I believe that you have someone locked up for June that we will get up soon. So yes, we've got the next couple of months all sorted for you, and we look forward to seeing you all again in a month's time.
Cool. Cheers, Warwick.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Awesome.